Welcome everyone to Office Hours. We're happy to have you with us today. We're very fortunate that we have two guests. We have Chuck Rackley, who is our Vice President, and we have Omar Gray, who is our Assistant Vice President. So welcome to both of you. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today. We appreciate it.
No problem.
Yeah,
Great.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. So we're going to talk about successful vendor transitions for maximum RCM, because obviously people look to transitioning to a vendor with hope for increased productivity. They want more efficient processes, streamlined workflow, increased revenue. Obviously, that's the reason they think about making a change, which sometimes can be disruptive, can be a lot of work. But I think the one thing that people really need to think about is what is the advanced planning, right, that has to be part of that transition process, and what happens if you don't do all the right planning and you don't give your vendor a clear line of sight into what they need to know. So we're going to talk about departments from patient access to coding, billing. So let's start by setting the landscape. Give us a general idea of what's happening, what in terms of vendor transitions, what you see, and what types of vendors we're talking about. Let's start there.
Sure. So I think it's important to bifurcate our conversation between a couple different things. So first off, you have your technology vendors, your bolt-on technologies into your electronic health record or your practice management system. And then the second is what we're going to talk about today. I think is more around the services. So we're talking about labor arbitrage, how we can leverage the people aspect of the service industry. So really looking at just revenue cycle vendors that are focused on everything from outsourced patient access, from pre-reg through off, and then into the middle office, and then in the back office, billing, AR, denials, those kinds of things.
So what are the most common mistakes that you see in vendor transitions? Because there have to be some commonalities throughout the industry of what happens during this process.
Sure. I'll kick it off, and then Omar, I'm sure you got some other ideas here. So the biggest mistake that I've seen personally, and that what we've seen as a group and in previous roles, is rushing to get to the finish line. So inevitably, most of the time when you have some sort of organizations that's looking to outsource a piece of their business, looking for a partner to take on some of that AR or take on some of that coding work, it's usually in a very big firefight that they're in already. They're already under the gun. They're already struggling to meet deadlines and hit productivity. So they want to get something done as fast as possible. And the biggest mistake that we see is rushing through these diligence process, this precision planning, like you said. I like that word. So in order to get to live as fast as possible. So I think what we'll talk about today a lot is those steps involved in that planning period that really hamstring you from a success factor.
Yep. And Chuck, what I will add to that is that, many health systems make transitions over time, whether they're changing their billing or their medical record or, platforms, that type of thing. And so, you see a lot of, where they've either had a vendor in there that previously managed that or helped them install that EHR, that type of thing. And so, it can be really quirky just to understand what was set up, and even ensuring that the history or that expertise is still around to be able to maneuver through what they have established there.
So before we go any further, I just wanted to ask another question about that. I can imagine that by the time a hospital or radiology practice gets to the point where they understand they need a new vendor, there have been multiple problems, and planning can seem like more delay. So why is planning not delay? Well,
the biggest thing I can tell you is it's about avoiding the ditch of performance. And what I mean by the ditch of performance, let's pretend like we're on The Price is Right and you have the yodeler going up, right? And you have that performance curve on cash, and all of a sudden you have a revenue cycle mix up. You have a big interruption in cash because you didn't do this delay. and all of a sudden cash dips. Now you may recover from that eventually, but this pre-planning and making sure everything is set, making sure all the access is there, and making sure you have the right people in the right seats, it just really can't be understated how important that is to avoid cash disruption. And that's really what it's all about. So you want to at least keep where you are, and then hopefully get some better performance out of your partner.
Like that, avoid cash destruction. And I like that, the price is right too. That's pretty good. So let's get more specific. Tell us which departments that you see of revenue cycle are experiencing the most issues when they're going into a transition.
Yeah, sure. I would definitely say patient access for sure, billing and coding, pretty much coding out of those three would stick out to me because, it can involve some specialty coding, different dynamics of documentation provided by physicians. That's really, really critical or important to ensure that it's solid from a coding aspect.
The thing I would add on to that would be after that process is over, the whole AR, all accounts receivable, denial remediation, underpayment remediation, I would add on to that as well.
So I'm sure that people would realize that a coding department would look toward a vendor, because I think they look at the coding department as the specialty itself. But coding is increasingly becoming diversified inside healthcare organizations, right? And they're certainly looked at as profit centers, which is probably about time. So when it comes to coding specifically, what kind of problems do you see when coding is transitioning to a new vendor? Because it seems like there's a lot on the line there. I mean, they are the funnel to revenue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead, Omar.
Yeah. So, what I've seen in my experience with coding can be really quirky and kind of defaulting back to the documentation piece of it, right? And so a lot of times your coding is only as great as the documentation is. And we all know healthcare to the degree that if it's not documented, it really didn't happen. So, there's different dynamics that has to be really strong and solid, right? Whether there's CDI and Compass there to ensure provider or physician education has been a strong point from an education perspective. And then there's also like the specialty coding that's involved, right? When you think of neuro, inpatient rehab, which is more driven at a CMG based level versus DRG. So there's those dynamics there. And then just having really good experienced coders to be able to sift through charts and understanding how the organization or health systems rules and guidelines are around ensuring documentation is there timely, right? So again, a coder can only code what's there. So when you go into a health organization and you look at that background and you try to pull that history and its existing state together, it could be really challenging.
No doubt. And the couple things I would add on to that, something we've seen people really struggle with, especially on kickoffs in coding, is the coding group's familiarization with the local EMR or practice management system. So there's coding is coding, is as everyone knows. So if you can code a radiology account, you can code a radiology account. But the issue comes into play when, okay, now what do I do with that? How do I get it to flow through the process correctly? So, Omar and I have seen recently a coding department transition where they didn't even know how to final code the account. There's different codes for different things. There's different actions for different systems. So if you've got a coder that has only worked in GE Centricity, or they've only worked in Epic, or they've only worked in Cerner, and you're trying to transition them to one of the other ones, it can really hamstring you for their productivity rate and their quality rate. It's extremely important. The other thing I would say on coding is, especially on the specialty side, like Omar said, when you get into these very complex specialties, I think he mentioned neuro, any kind of specialty surgery, rad oncology, these things that are very specialized areas of coding, you can't really just fit a really smart coder into that spot. You've got to get someone that has years of experience there to feel comfortable and know that your productivity is going to be there and your quality is going to be there. So the thing that I see a lot of people make mistakes with is they're just under the gun to get coders in seats. And so they'll take whoever they can get. But in our experience, it's worth taking that time to find the right person there. The other thing I would we see a lot is when you have a coding transition of any kind, it's very common to see physicians have backlash against what they're seeing from an RVU and productivity perspective, specifically in E&M codes. So if a rad-onc doctor or even an ER doctor is used to a certain level for the work they're doing, and all of a sudden they see a change, there's going to be some explaining to do, to quote another old TV show for you, Deb. So there's always that transition time there where the docs have to get used to it, and you may have a doc that throws up all kinds of fits about how their charts are being coded. You may have to explain that and explain to them, said, hey, this is what we see. Just like Omar said, if it's not there, if it's not documented, we can't do it. So the important thing is to code it right, not to code it for the maximum reimbursement. That's the most important thing to keep in mind.
So as you're talking, I'm thinking about hospitals that are expanding oncology clinics, they're expanding their orthopedic practice, they're bringing in cardiac cath labs, they're expanding cardiovascular and bringing in new physician groups. Is coding and the vendor support that they need part of this conversation, as far as you know?
Absolutely. It maybe not as much as it should be, because it's almost one for one when you start to bring in new physicians into that area. So if you've got a couple specialties, and all of a sudden you've got a specialty that sounds like it'd be really similar, like one that we see a lot is, if I've got radiology coders, they should be able to do the radiation oncology coding as well. It couldn't be further from the truth, and that's a layman's mistake that I've made as well. Just not being a clinician. And so typically when you have non-clinician people making clinical decisions, these are the mistakes that can happen that keep you from maintaining your level of performance.
Yeah, it's a very interesting fine point. Before I ask the next question, I want to make sure to remind our attendees today that if you have a question, please just put it in the chat, and we will make sure that it gets answered for you. So billing departments, that's another specialty. They have a lot on the line. If they're transitioning, let's have the same kind of conversation, but about backlogging. About transitioning there. What are some common areas that create backlogs inside that revenue cycle that can be avoided when the billing department goes through this transition?
Yeah, I'll chime in here. I think, there's, a bunch of stuck AR. You can almost start anywhere, right? There's stuck claims related to client billing where there's not a really solid process around it. You tend to see a lot where, just rough or no follow-up from an AR perspective, where there's no logic or methodical logic built in place to be able to work AR, right? And so when I say that to say this is there's a ton of denials in there. There's non-credentialed physicians, or no bridge routines, where there's clunky processes creating a lot of backlog, where either it's through a system transition or system conversion, or someone previously being there just not keen or hadn't researched or did enough to actually drive some really hardcore day-to-day drivers to get AR out there, right? I've even been in places where there's not even a real rapport with the payer for like specific follow-up or escalated type claims to be able to drive AR to get payment on there. So it could be a many things. What would you add to that, Chuck?
A couple of things come to mind quickly, Omar, is that number one, the knowledge transfer that happens between the client and the partner, it's so important, especially in billing, to know how to resolve very nuanced, specific examples that happen inside that, even the simplest of offices all the way up to a multi-hospital system. So there's always going to be little quirks and rules in these systems that they're going to trip billing departments up. And a lot of times people, like I said earlier, they rush to just get live and they don't spend enough time teaching how do I really want these accounts to be billed and collected on. And sometimes you have situations where you're going from one vendor to another vendor. And sometimes the client just doesn't know to tell you. And that can create a serious business problem when it comes to maintaining that cash level, maintaining your billing numbers, maintaining your unbilled, your denial rates, because the new vendor either doesn't know to ask or they just can't get a good answer because the client doesn't know either. So you end up in a situation where the vendor and the partner is trying to figure out these problems one at a time, which takes forever, and it really slows things down. And it can be avoided with proper planning on the front end. The other thing that has really been missed by so many vendors, it makes me very nervous anytime I hear someone saying I'm transitioning all my billing work to one vendor or another, is the payer enrollment system. So a lot of people don't realize that if you don't have the right payer enrollment documents filled out, they won't pay you if you're doing work on the system's behalf or the provider's behalf. So, and especially Medicare is one of those where you have to have the right DDE access, you have to have the right clearinghouse access and the fiscal intermediary access to get even paid from these people. If you've done everything right and it comes through without a denial, they will still hold payments if you haven't done this. And this is almost for every single of the big payers. So I hope everyone listening to this, if you're going to a vendor, make sure they do the work to ensure they're able to bill and collect for you. And so make sure you get paid.
These are really expensive details if they're not done correct.
Extremely. You can bankrupt a hospital in 2 months if you don't do these things correctly. There's a colleague of ours, of Omar and I's, that says it takes 1 month to screw up an ATB and a billing system, and it can take 6-7 months to fix that 1 month of mistake. It really can.
No one can afford that these days. I mean,
No.
they couldn't afford it before, but now especially.
No, you really
every
can.
dime and every dime's essential. So we just kind of started tripping along the edge of that, but AR and denials, they're really common, really very costly. Where have you seen partners fall on this during the initial stages of engagement?
So this is going to be a similar statement for me here is to know how the client wants these things worked. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So like low balance threshold is one that comes up a lot, where you have all these accounts out there for $6, $8, $10. And sometimes the vendor spends a lot of worthless time working on these. And they want the right thing to do is to write them off, or put them to some sort of low balance threshold queue. And sometimes you don't even spend enough time to say, okay, hey, I want you to work the high balances down or on these days, or I want you to work, this payer these days, and how this is how I want you to actually work this AR. And they just let the vendor do what they want to do. And then when cash doesn't come in the right way, it's not really appropriate. The other thing I would say is on that follow-up piece, and Omar alluded to this earlier, is on notation. So if you have a vendor that's doing follow-up work for you, it's very important in our experience to say, hey, when you follow up on an account, this is the kind of notation I want you to make. This is the kind of follow-up that I want to happen, because I can get any 19-year-old off the street and I can teach them how to call Blue Cross and just check status. But the important thing is you have to actually move that account along towards resolution. So what action are we taking? Are we just calling and statusing? Are we calling and getting a status and doing the next thing? And a lot of vendors are so guilty of this, where they'll just call up, get a status, put a note on it, move on to the next, just to keep that productivity up. You see this especially in vendors that are only FTE based. So instead of contingency based, you're just paying, a couple $1,000s a month per FTE. And you just have these productivity shops where they're reporting back to you, hey, we're at 120% productivity. It looks really great, but they're not actually doing anything on the transition work. So it's important, and the reason I'm saying that is it's important to get all that covered during the not just the initial sales process, but the implementation process, to explain, hey, here's what a valid follow-up looks like. Here's how I want it notated, and here's the follow-up that should be happening on it. I'll pause there and let Omar get a word or two in.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Chuck, I think you're spot on, right? That AR piece and follow up and having logic and methodology to work it is super critical, right? I'm gonna harp on the denial aspect of it is, and that's important because that's one of the highest uncompensated care factors in a health system or a physician's office that you know there's always not enough emphasis that we can put on, right? And I say that because a lot of times what you see when you go in there, there's not enough education or not enough laser focused eyes on what they're not getting paid on. And we all know that payers change rules all the time, right? Today they may, a payer could, not want an off or a referral for a CT with contrast, and tomorrow they change it. So it takes someone in the back office to be following up on payer updates, bulletins, so that, and have a strong managed care program involved as well to ensure that everyone's well aware of what they should be getting paid on or not. But for the most part, also designing processes to understand and reporting to know, to say, hey, if all CTs with contrast for UHC and Blue Cross require an authorization, then we got the right controls in place from from scheduling to pre-registration, all the way to getting that bill out of the door, that there's a process in place to make sure we get paid. So I can't put enough emphasis on the denial piece. I think that's one of the most critical pain points in health systems, requiring a lot of work.
Yeah, one final note on denials. Omar just reminded me of something. The one thing we've seen be very successful is when you start to have these denial committees, especially in systems that are even providers that where you just have a back office person talking to the vendor about their denial work, and then they kind of relaying that around. That's the fastest way in our experience to create silos within revenue cycle companies and hospitals and providers, is to start saying, okay, well, this is really the front end's responsibility, or the coders really messed this one up. And there's really not good communication that goes back and forth there. So when you're setting up a new partner for denial remediation work, the best practice here is obviously set up, and if you haven't already done this, denial committees that look at what's coming in off those 835s, what are the denial types, like Omar said, and really going back to root cause and working with patient access, working with the pre-auth and pre-reg people to understand what are the real things happening here that's leading to a denial, and having that dialogue and really problem solving that all the way through, rather than just having a CFO or a director of rev cycle always just pointing back to the front office.
I was going to ask you, you've mentioned several times the importance of logic. Can you give us a quick example of what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of it is simple controls, right? So, whether there's a cheat sheet or a agnostic technology that could be used, to trigger, to say anytime the CPT code is entered or hits a program, based from a registration or billing perspective, that it triggers or provides an alert of such to say, okay, this will require an off. I think that's from a manual perspective of a cheat sheet, all the way to having an alert with the CPT code or HCPCS code entered in a program, could also steer and be some logical methodology to counter not getting paid.
Okay, great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of setting appropriate service level agreements and baselines prior to bringing a new vendor on? That seems like a very, very important step.
Yeah. Omar, grab a seat. Get comfortable. I'm going to talk for a while on this one.
Sure.
So I'll start backwards. So the baseline period, it cannot be understated for a couple of reasons. So first of all, when you have a new partner relationship, it's important to set up what's good performance look like, what does bad performance look like. Here's my expectation of that. And the best way to do it in our experience is setting what the baseline is. What has been happening up to this point? I can't tell you how many times I've seen this in the past, where you have an organization that gets a vendor on, and the first time they have a big report out, It's like, okay, that's great. That's your performance, but what's better about what you're doing than what we were doing before? That is so common in that partnership scenario that it really what breaks a lot of partner relationships. So, the biggest piece of advice on this area is make sure you set the baseline, make sure both parties agree on what that baseline is and where you should be going forward. Once you've done that, you can start to set SLAs on top of that to say, like for example, if you've got a net collection rate of 97% and both parties understand what that is, you can start to set SLAs on that to say, okay, for every percentage point below this, I get certain rebate, or every percentage point over it, you get a bonus or whatever it is. But it's important to kind of set the boundaries of what good performance looks like on both parties, rather than just here's a bunch of stuff, good luck, let me know how you're doing. That's the best way to not have a partner, and that's the best way to have a vendor. So I know this is a very common nomenclature, and I'm guilty of it too, saying client and vendor, but that kind of relationship is one where it's just transactional, and I'm just using you as a body farm just to get this stuff done. The ones that we see are much more successful is when there's a common knowledge of what the performance should look like, and how to measure it, and what the metrics should be looking like. I'll pause for a second, let Omar get a word in edgewise.
Yeah, no, I think you said it well, right? I mean, having that that level set or common playing field that, between you and the client both agree on is really important, right? And so if you're off base or off on a particular metric and have two different concepts or ideas or agreement on what that target, that dollar or whatever it may be is, then you're just causing disarray. So and definitely will never be on the same page if you don't have that common ground with it. So I would definitely say those elevated or additional steps above baselines are important, right? Because it not only does it set new heights, but when you get to specific points of specific targets or whatever it may be, you may need to go back and reevaluate, due to different dynamics of, what you've rolled out, or, different dynamics of the payer world changes, et cetera, that type of thing. You have that level set and that relationship to go back to the table and talk about it.
And Deb, I'll give you a really good example of this where there was a misunderstanding of what performance is, and it could have been solved in the implementation stage. So several years ago, this is back when I was working as a provider myself, I had a vendor come in and say, hey, we had the best month of collections ever for the facility. It was 10% over last month. And, I said, first of all, that sounds really great, right? I mean, how could you be upset with that? But what they didn't show me was that the net revenue was 15% higher than it was the previous month. So even though they had collected more money, they actually collected less of that money than they have in the past. So while it looks on the surface that is a really good month of collection and you guys killed it, and everyone, round of drinks on me, they really underperformed based on where they should have. So that problem could have been solved before that, where we set the baseline of, hey, here's how we're going to measure productivity. Here's how we're going to measure performance. It's going to be cash as a percent of net revenue for the prior two, or cash net NCRs on this rate. But it's important to set that context prior to getting started, so everyone knows what the rules are.
Yeah, those are incredible. That's an incredible example. And that goes back to your point of making sure that you agree on performance at the outset, and you define the terms of what is performance, right? So what about appropriate service level agreements?
So the service level agreements here, they're going to come into place where you're going to agree on certain metrics that are going to be met. So like I gave you an example earlier. So if we're going to say everyone's going to be at 97.5% of NCR, and that's what we're going to agree to, that's a very common one, is on net collection rate. Net AR days is also very common. Aging greater than 90 or greater than 60, depending on the payer. Your coding unbilled is very common. What are some other ones, Omar, you can think of?
So you mentioned front end cash collections could be one, denial reduction or your denial rate against, AR is another good one. DNFB, I think you mentioned that one as well. Those are practically the common one, even if you're on the patient pay or self-pay side, looking at bad debt, right? Reduction of bad debt. We know there's a lot of payers pushing a lot toward the patient these days. So we need to understand that we're doing a solid job there as well.
And there's some other ones that come into play that get overlooked a lot on the non-cash generating side. So like if you had outsourced your posting department, there are other SLAs that can be put in there on things like unbilled or unapplied, your cash reconciliation goals. Customer service departments come into play here too. Your answer to call time, your wait times, your abandoned call rate. These are all things that are very SLA-able. And I just made up a new word, but things that can be put into contracts so people understand what the rules are.
So we're out of time, but we do have a question from one of our attendees that I think is really important to answer. And that is, we are beginning to think about looking at vendors. What are the questions that we need to ask them about their planning process to help us sort through the vendors?
I think you want to ask them some very specific. So without knowing what the specialty or what the hospital size is, I would ask something that only you would know, or only someone that had some experience in that specific area would know how to do. So like for example, if you are a trauma physician and you would ask them, okay, what kind of protections do you put in to make sure the trauma codes are put into place so we don't miss them? So they would know these kind of very specific planning things. The other thing I would want to ask them about is, what are you doing to staff up for this? What kind of bench strength do you have? What is your training process to get up to speed if you are hiring people? Other thing to understand is where are these people going to be? Are they onshore? Are they offshore? What is the training for those? Are the productivities different? And ask them very specific operational questions on, do you have experience in this EMR? If you're on Cerner, hey, how do you deal with lights on? How do you use lights on? So just some very specific questions to kind of pressure test. Are these guys just reading me the script, or do they really understand from a process perspective what it's going to take to get this up and going? That would be my first thing out of the gate.
Thank you. One more. It's very interesting to hear you talk about defining performance. Who, in your experience in the department, is part of that process to define what performance is?
So it depends on what we're talking about from an outsourcing perspective. So I would say, first of all, the power person in the client site, which is like the person signing the document, they better have a very good understanding of what the puts and takes are to how we're going to define performance. So that's number one. Number two, the operational leader of that unit. So whether it be the coding department or the AR department or billing or whatever it is, that person should understand, hey, here's what's possible. And then here's where we are. So I would say both the signature and the actual leader of that operational department should have overall say on how that's going to be written.
Great, thank you. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much for your time. This has been a very substantive discussion, I think, with a lot of important insights about how to successfully transition to a new vendor for maximum RCM. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you everyone who attended today.
Enjoyed it, everyone. Thanks.
Absolutely. See ya.
Thank you.